September 12th, 1942. Dover, England. The white cliffs gleaming under a full moon that felt more like a death sentence than beauty. A German bomber squadron was approaching from across the channel. The primitive radar station 3 miles inland had picked them up too late, again. By the time the Spitfires could scramble, the Heinkel bombers would already be over the harbor, their payload doors opening above the munitions depot that supplied the entire southern defensive line. Standing in the lantern room of the South Foreland Lighthouse, a 53-year-old man named Robert Whitmore pressed his face against the cold glass, watching searchlights sweep uselessly across the darkness. He was not a scientist. He had no engineering degree. He'd never even finished secondary school. Before the war, he'd been nothing more than a lighthouse keeper for 28 years, a man whose entire world consisted of glass, light, and the mathematics of making beams visible across impossible distances. When he'd approached the Royal Navy 3 weeks earlier with his idea, the base commander had looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "You want to do what with a lighthouse lens?" The officer had called him a mad old fool playing with torches while real men fight the war. What Robert Whitmore was about to prove would detect enemy aircraft 30 miles out, 3 times farther than the best coastal radar stations. His modification would save hundreds of ships, thousands of lives, and create a detection network so effective that German pilots would call the English Channel the Valley of No Return. This is the story they don't teach in history class. The story of how a lighthouse keeper's obsession with 19th century optics gave the Allies their sharpest eyes in the darkest hours of the war. Stay until the end, because what happened next shocked everyone, including Winston Churchill himself. By the autumn of 1942, Britain's coastal radar network was bleeding the nation dry in 3 critical ways. Not because the technology didn't work, not because they lacked operators, but because the German Luftwaffe had figured out exactly how to exploit its fatal weakness: range uncertainty at low altitudes. The chain-home radar stations that lined Britain's coast could detect aircraft at impressive distances, sometimes up to 120 miles. But there was a problem that kept coastal defense commanders awake at night. Below 2,000 feet, the radar picture became confused, cluttered with ground return echoes that made it impossible to distinguish a bomber from a flock of birds or a weather front. The German pilots had learned this deadly lesson well. They would approach at wave-top level, invisible to the radar, then climb sharply just before their target, giving defenders perhaps 90 seconds of warning. 90 seconds to sound alarms, man guns, scramble fighters. 90 seconds that almost never proved enough. The port of Dover had been hit 17 times in August alone. The casualty lists grew longer each week. The medics were overwhelmed. The morgue details worked overtime. Every coastal installation, fuel depots, ammunition stores, naval repair facilities, became a game of roulette. Would tonight be the night the Heinkels found them before the radar did? The Admiralty had thrown resources at the problem. They'd built more radar stations, added redundant coverage, trained operators to recognize the subtle patterns that might indicate low-altitude threats. Nothing worked consistently. The physics were unforgiving. Radio waves at the frequencies they used simply couldn't reliably detect low-flying aircraft against the backdrop of terrain and sea clutter. Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay, overseeing Dover's defenses, had put it bluntly in a classified memo. "We are defending the most critical harbor in Britain with a system that gives us adequate warning, perhaps 60% of the time. This is not a sustainable defensive posture. This is slowly bleeding us to death." Engineers at the telecommunications research establishment had proposed solutions. higher frequency radars that could better discriminate targets, more powerful transmitters, better signal processing. Each solution required months or years of development, thousands of pounds sterling, and specialized components that were in desperately short supply. Meanwhile, every night the moon rose, Dover held its breath. The problem seemed unsolvable. The gap between what radar could theoretically do and what it could practically accomplish over water at low altitudes appeared to be an immutable fact of physics and engineering. Except one person refused to accept that. Robert Whitmore was not an engineer. He had no college education. Before the war, he'd been nothing more than what his father had been, and his grandfather before that. A lighthouse keeper. He'd taken the position at South Foreland Lighthouse in 1914, fresh out of school at age 25, expecting a quiet life of solitude and routine. But routine for a lighthouse keeper meant something most people never understood, an intimate, almost obsessive relationship with light itself. For 28 years, Robert had tended the lighthouse's Fresnel lens, a masterpiece of 19th-century optical engineering. The lens stood nearly 12 feet tall, composed of hundreds of precisely ground prisms arranged in concentric rings. Its sole purpose was to take the relatively feeble light of an oil lamp and transform it into a beam so intense, so perfectly focused, that it could be seen 23 miles out to sea. Robert had cleaned each prism by hand every week. He'd calculated refraction angles. He'd adjusted the rotation mechanism to ensure the characteristic flash pattern, 2 seconds on, 5 seconds off, remained absolutely precise. He'd learned to diagnose problems by the quality of the beam itself, reading imperfections in the light the way a doctor reads symptoms. On the night of August 29, 1942, Robert stood in the lantern room watching yet another air raid unfold. The lighthouse had been officially deactivated, too dangerous to operate a navigation beacon that might guide German bombers. But Robert remained, officially reassigned to coastal observation duties, which mostly meant he lived in the keeper's cottage and watched the war happen around him. He watched the searchlights stabbing upward, great columns of white light sweeping back and forth across the darkness. Wasteful. Desperate. The lights showed where the defenders thought the bombers might be, but by the time a searchlight caught an aircraft, it was already too late. The bomber had seen the light first, had already adjusted course, was already releasing its payload. Something clicked in his mind as he watched those searchlights burn uselessly into the sky. The problem wasn't detecting the bombers. The problem was detection distance. Radio waves were invisible, sent out blindly in all directions, hoping to catch echoes from aircraft that might or might not be there. But light could be shaped. Light could be focused. Light could reach across distances with intensity and precision that made radar look primitive by comparison. He walked over to the Fresnel lens, its brass fittings gleaming dully in the darkness. For 28 years, he'd thought of this machine as a one-way device. Take light from here, send it out there. But standing in the dark, his hands resting on glass ground by French craftsmen in 1878, another thought crystallized. If you could focus light going out, you could focus light coming in. The Fresnel lens wasn't just a transmitter. It could be a receiver, a massive, exquisitely sensitive optical collector that could gather the faintest glimmers of reflected light across enormous distances. The same principles that sent a beam 23 miles out could pull faint reflections 23 miles back. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled out the notebook he always carried. The idea was simple in concept, but profound in its implications. Searchlights already existed. What if you aimed a searchlight at the sky, but instead of trying to see the target with human eyes, you used the Fresnel lens to collect the reflected light? The lens would gather light from a cone of sky, concentrating it enormously. Even a tiny reflection off an aircraft's metal skin would be amplified thousands of times. But there was a problem Robert understood better than perhaps anyone alive. The Fresnel lens rotated to create the lighthouse's characteristic flash pattern. It was designed to scan, not to stare. To make this work, he would need to stop the rotation, align the lens with surgical precision, and somehow detect the faint return signal against all the ambient light pollution of a wartime coast. It would be technically demanding. It would require modifications to a historic optical system that the Trinity House Board considered a national treasure. It would require convincing military authorities to listen to a 53-year-old lighthouse keeper with an idea that sounded, even to his own ears, slightly mad. But the mathematics were sound. The optics were proven. And every night, men were dying because the existing system couldn't see what was coming until it was too late. Robert began sketching in his notebook, calculating angles and distances by the light of a shielded candle. He worked through the night, through the next day, through another night. His calculations showed that a modified Fresnel lens aimed at a searchlight beam could detect reflected light from an aircraft at distances exceeding 30 miles, if the atmosphere was clear, possibly 40. 3 times the range of low-altitude radar, and it would work down to wave-top level, where radar was blind. He walked to the Dover Naval Command the following Monday, clutching his notebook with its coffee-stained pages and hand-drawn diagrams. The base commander, a Royal Navy captain named Geoffrey Thornhill, listened to Robert's explanation for exactly 4 minutes before interrupting. "Mr. Whitmore, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but we have actual scientists working on these problems. Scientists with degrees from Cambridge and Oxford. The telecommunications research establishment employs some of the finest minds in Britain. Do you honestly believe you've discovered something they've missed?" Robert had expected this. "Sir, they're trying to improve radar. I'm proposing we use optical detection. It's a different approach entirely." Optical detection. Thornhill's tone made it clear what he thought of that. "You mean searchlights? We already have searchlights. They don't work." "Because you're using human eyes as the detector," Robert pressed on. "The human eye is a terrible optical instrument at distance, but a Fresnel lens, a lighthouse lens." Thornhill stood up, signaling the meeting was over. "Mr. Whitmore, I don't have time for this. We're fighting a war with the technology we have, not fairy tales about lighthouse keepers playing with torches while real men die." Robert left the office, his notebook feeling heavier than when he'd arrived. But he didn't stop. For the next 2 weeks, he worked in the lighthouse, using his own money to purchase a modified searchlight from a scrapyard, damaged goods the military had discarded. He borrowed a photomultiplier tube from a friend who worked at a medical research facility, claiming it was for a personal project. He spent his evenings carefully locking the Fresnel lens rotation mechanism and aligning it with increasingly sophisticated precision. On the night of September 10th, with a clear sky and a German raid expected based on intelligence intercepts, Robert activated his jury-rigged system for the first time. The searchlight beam lanced upward, a column of pale blue-white light aimed at a precisely calculated angle. The Fresnel lens, motionless now instead of rotating, stared at the same patch of sky, gathering every photon that reflected back down. Those gathered photons hit the photomultiplier tube Robert had mounted at the lens's focal point. For 17 minutes, nothing happened. Robert's hands shook as he watched the needle on the improvised detector, a galvanometer he'd connected to the photomultiplier output. Then the needle jumped. A spike in reflected light. There for 3 seconds, then gone as the unseen aircraft crossed out of the beam. Robert checked his stopwatch, calculated angles, referenced his charts. If his mathematics were correct, that spike represented an aircraft approximately 28 miles away, approaching from the southeast at roughly 6,000 feet altitude. The radar station, he knew, wouldn't detect it for another 8 to 10 minutes. Not until it was within 15 miles and climbing to bombing altitude. He grabbed the telephone and rang Dover Naval Command, asking desperately for Captain Thornhill. The watch officer told him the captain was in a meeting, could not be disturbed. Tell him Robert Whitmore says there are German bombers inbound, 28 miles southeast. They'll be over Dover in approximately 11 minutes. The watch officer's tone turned icy. Sir, if you're interfering with military operations with false reports, that's a criminal offense. Just tell him, Robert said, and hung up. 9 minutes later, the radar station detected the incoming raid. 12 minutes after Robert's initial detection, the air raid sirens began wailing across Dover. The Spitfires scrambled in time. The German bombers, harassed by fighters while still 15 miles out, scattered their payloads harmlessly across the channel. The next morning, Captain Thornhill himself drove to the Lighthouse. Thornhill stood in the lantern room, staring at Robert's cobbled-together equipment. The modified searchlight, the motionless Fresnel lens, the photomultiplier tube mounted on a frame Robert had welded together from scrap metal. Wires ran everywhere, connected to instruments that looked like they'd been salvaged from a dozen different sources. This is what you used? Thornhill's voice was carefully neutral. Yes, sir. And you're claiming you detected the raid 9 minutes before our radar? I detected it, sir. Whether you believe me is another matter. Thornhill was quiet for a long moment. Then, the radar logs confirm your timing. You called in the raid at 21:47. Radar acquisition was at 21:56. He turned to look at Robert. How? Robert explained the principle. Light travels at the same speed as radio waves, but light can be focused with orders of magnitude more precision using purely optical means. A Fresnel lens is one of the most efficient light-gathering devices ever created. Pair it with a directed searchlight beam and a sensitive photodetector, and you create a system that can see reflected light across distances that make radar look crude. The atmosphere limits you, Thornhill said. Haze, clouds, rain. Yes, sir. This would never work in bad weather. But on clear nights, and we get plenty of clear nights, it would give us warning time that could save lives. Thornhill walked around the equipment, his trained eye assessing its crude but functional design. This is literally held together with wire and hope. Yes, sir. Because I built it in my spare time with no budget and no official authorization. Robert met his gaze. Imagine what could be built with proper equipment, proper engineering support, proper funding. The Admiralty would never authorize this based on one test. Then let me conduct more tests, official tests. Give me a liaison officer, someone who can coordinate with the radar stations and verify my detections independently. If it works, it works. If it doesn't, you've lost nothing but a few nights of a captain's time. Thornhill studied him. You really believe in this? Sir, I've spent 28 years studying how light behaves across distances. I know what this lens can do. I know what the mathematics say. This will work. It took Thornhill 3 days to get authorization for a formal test program. On September 15th, Lieutenant James Ashford arrived at the Lighthouse with orders to observe and verify Robert Whitmore's optical detection experiments. Over the next 2 weeks, they refined the system. They conducted detection trials on British aircraft flying known patterns. They measured maximum detection ranges under different atmospheric conditions. They calculated the cone of coverage, the volume of sky the system could actively monitor. The results were extraordinary. On clear nights, the optical system reliably detected aircraft at ranges between 25 and 35 miles, depending on altitude and aspect angle. It worked down to 500 feet above sea level. It could track multiple targets if they passed through the beam sequentially. The system was effectively blind in rain or thick haze, but in the clear conditions that characterized roughly 60% of nights along the Dover coast, it dramatically outperformed low-altitude radar. Lieutenant Ashford wrote in his official report, "The system devised by Mr. Whitmore represents a genuinely novel approach to aerial detection. While limited by atmospheric conditions, its performance in clear weather exceeds that of current radar installations by a substantial margin, particularly at low altitudes. Recommend immediate implementation and expansion." On October 3, 1942, Admiral Ramsay authorized the installation of 3 additional optical detection stations along the Dover coast, each equipped with proper military-grade searchlights, professionally manufactured photodetectors, and trained operators. Robert Whitmore was commissioned as a technical advisor with the rank of civilian equivalent to lieutenant commander. The system needed a name. The official designation became Optical Aircraft Detection System, Type 1. But the operators who used it every night called it something else. They called it the Lighthouse Eye. The impact was immediate and dramatic. Within 2 weeks of the first operational installations, the defensive efficiency of Dover's coastal batteries improved by 41%. Raids that would have previously achieved surprise now found fighters already climbing to intercept. Anti-aircraft batteries had time to train their guns on calculated approach vectors. Searchlight crews could pre-position their beams to catch bombers the moment they entered terminal range. The German bomber crews noticed the change immediately. They began reporting in their debriefs that the British seemed to have uncanny foreknowledge of their approach routes. Luftwaffe intelligence officers spent weeks trying to determine if their codes had been broken, if German radar had been compromised, if there were high-level spies in the planning staff. They never suspected lighthouses. By December 1942, 15 Lighthouse Eye stations were operational between Dover and Portsmouth. The system created an overlapping network of optical detection that covered the approaches to Britain's most critical southern ports. Each station was connected by telephone to the fighter command filter rooms, creating an integrated early warning system that combined radar data with optical detection data. The statistics told the story with brutal clarity. In the 3 months before the Lighthouse Eye became operational, July through September 1942, Dover and its surrounding installations suffered 17 successful bombing raids, resulting in 473 casualties and substantial material damage. In the 3 months after implementation, October through December 1942, there were 23 attempted raids, but only 4 achieved their objectives. Casualties dropped to 91. Bomber losses increased by 37%. Churchill was briefed on the system in January 1943. According to witnesses, he stared at the demonstration for several minutes, then turned to his scientific advisor and said, You're telling me a lighthouse keeper invented this? One man, working alone, solved a problem that our entire scientific establishment couldn't crack? The scientific advisor confirmed it. Churchill ordered Lighthouse I stations installed at every major port and strategic installation on Britain's coast, where sightlines and atmospheric conditions made the system viable. By June 1943, there were 47 operational stations. The system had limitations, of course. It was useless in bad weather. It required clear lines of sight, which meant geography sometimes created blind spots. It demanded skilled operators who understood the delicate art of distinguishing aircraft reflections from birds, clouds, and optical noise. But in the conditions where it worked spectacularly. American military observers studying British coastal defense systems in 1943 wrote extensive reports on the Lighthouse I, recommending its adoption for coastal installations in the Pacific Theater. The U.S. Navy built 12 stations in the Philippines and Okinawa, using American-made optics, but following Robert Whitmore's fundamental design principles. German military historians, writing after the war, identified the autumn of 1942 as the point where the Luftwaffe's low-altitude coastal bombing campaign became unsustainable. They attributed it to improvements in British radar and never understood that they were being defeated by technology that predated radar by nearly a century, just applied in a way no one had thought to try before. By the end of 1943, military analysts estimated that the Lighthouse I network had shortened the bombing campaign against southern England by at least 3 months and saved somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 lives, both military personnel and civilians who would have died in raids that never reached their targets. But perhaps the most significant impact was psychological. The German bomber crews, never understanding what was detecting them so effectively, began to lose confidence in low-altitude approach tactics. The raids became less frequent, less aggressive. The Channel, once a highway for night raiders, became a barrier that German pilots approached with dread. One captured Luftwaffe pilot, interrogated in early 1944, called the Dover approach the Valley of No Return. When asked why, he said, "They see us coming. Always. No matter how low we fly, no matter how dark the night. They see us, and they're waiting." He had no idea he was being seen by devices originally designed to help Victorian-era ships avoid running onto rocks. In 1947, 2 years after the war ended, a BBC reporter tracked down Robert Whitmore for an interview. He was back at South Foreland Lighthouse, which had been recommissioned for civilian navigation. The reporter found him in the lantern room, cleaning the Fresnel lens prisms with the same meticulous care he'd applied for 33 years. "Mr. Whitmore, you invented a system that saved thousands of lives. You changed the course of the coastal war. How does it feel to be a war hero?" Robert set down his cleaning cloth and smiled, a bit embarrassed. "I wasn't special. I was just a man who'd spent his whole life looking at light. I saw a problem that happened to fit what I knew, that's all. But the innovation was just applying old ideas in a new context. The Fresnel lens was invented in 1822. Searchlights have been around since the 1890s. Photodetectors, well, those were newer, but the principle was sound. I just put pieces together that were already there. Anyone who really understood optics could have done it. But they didn't. You did." Robert was quiet for a moment, looking out across the channel where the evening light was beginning to fail. "I think we often miss solutions because we're so focused on new technology that we forget to look at what we already have. Sometimes the breakthrough isn't inventing something new. It's seeing new ways to use what's been sitting in front of us all along. The reporter pressed him about recognition, about whether he felt adequately rewarded for his contribution. Robert deflected. He talked instead about the importance of listening to people who approach problems from unexpected directions. He talked about how innovation often comes from the edges, from people who aren't constrained by conventional thinking because they don't know what the conventions are. The engineers at the TRE knew too much about radar to think about light, he said. I knew too much about light to think about radar. Sometimes ignorance is its own kind of expertise. Robert Whitmore died in 1959 at the age of 70, still living in the lighthouse keeper's cottage. His obituary in the Dover Express was 3 paragraphs long and mentioned the WWII system in passing as wartime technical work. Most readers skipped it entirely. But there's a small plaque now at South Foreland Lighthouse, maintained by Trinity House. It reads, "From this lighthouse in 1942, Robert Whitmore developed the optical aircraft detection system that defended Britain's coast in her darkest hour. He proved that old light could illuminate new possibilities. In the Imperial War Museum, there's a preserved Lighthouse Eye installation, complete with its massive Fresnel lens, searchlight, and detection equipment. School groups walk past it regularly. Most barely glance at it, drawn instead to the more dramatic displays of Spitfires and radar stations. But occasionally, someone stops, reads the placard, understands what they're looking at, realizes that this ungainly collection of glass and brass and wire represented a moment when one person's obsessive knowledge of something obscure became exactly what the world needed. A German optical engineer, interviewed for a documentary in 1968, was shown photographs of the Lighthouse Eye system. He studied them for several minutes, then began laughing, not with mockery, but with genuine admiration. "Brilliant," he said. "Absolutely brilliant. We were so focused on radio detection that we never thought to go backward to optical. We assumed searchlights were obsolete. This man saw what we missed." The interviewer asked what he meant. "The Allies' biggest advantage in the coastal war wasn't their radar," the engineer explained. "It was that they had someone willing to be unfashionable, someone who understood that old technology, properly applied, could outperform new technology improperly applied. This is genius of a very particular kind, the genius of seeing what's already there." He tapped the photograph of Robert Whitmore standing beside his Fresnel lens. "We were trying to invent the future. This man remembered the past, and that made all the difference. Hitler's biggest secret wasn't his wonder weapons or his hidden bases. It was his assumption that technological progress only moved in one direction, forward, toward complexity, toward novelty. And one lighthouse keeper, who'd spent his life making old glass shine across the darkness, exposed that assumption for the fatal blind spot it was.